Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Stephen Rothwell from FansUnite. Stephen, thank you very much for coming on. Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter @BettingPod and check out the website businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Stephen Rothwell from FansUnite. Stephen, thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. Much obliged.
So, Stephen, let's go back to your initial start with sports betting. Take us through where you're from, how that sort of started, and then we'll get to what you're up to today with FansUnite.
Sure. So I'm a Canadian. I'm from Winnipeg. Moved to Vancouver on the West Coast pretty early. I've been pretty much into betting since an early age because my dad was a fairly degenerate gambler. And pretty much gambled on baseball, hockey every day. So I kind of grew up with that mentality, wise guy mentality in the Assiniboine Downs in Winnipeg, betting on horses and stuff. And so I've just kind of carried that through in my life. Did a degree in math and physics, so I got pretty good with numbers. And just studying data science in general, machine learning, I took an interest in sports data because it's a very challenging data set to work on. And kind of everything ballooned after my college years into basically where I am now, betting on sports. That's kind of my background, I suppose.
What's it like betting on sports from Canada or in Canada or throughout your college years? What was the industry like? How did you go about it back then?
Yeah, well, we start on the Canadian government sportsbook, which is ProLine. So that's kind of where I started, and just terrible odds, right? You get 40 to 1, 6 picks, and that kind of went down to 25 to 1, and you don't really get any kind of nice low margin solutions in Canada. So that kind of led into me going offshore, of course, discovered Pinnacle and their great lines, and that's kind of where I bet mostly. Once Bitcoin came out, I switched directly to Bitcoin when it was kind of low, about $300, and started betting on Nitro. So I would say in Canada, to answer your question, it's pretty open in general. Matchbook left, which kind of sucked for us. But in general, we have Pinnacle, we have Nitro. So we have everything we need.
So what was your approach to sports betting? Were you a passionate fan that would bet on your team or teams, or would you bet against the teams you hated, or were you more sophisticated even at the early stages?
Yeah, directly I started with machine learning pretty early because that was kind of my background in college. So I kind of cut my teeth on financial models in the financial industry using exotic computing. And from there, I just kind of approached sports directly from a data science point of view. So my strategy was always to collect as much data as I possibly could and try to let the data drive the decisions with algorithms. And from day one, that's kind of all I've been doing, is trying to figure out how to win in the current environment algorithmically.
So tell us, in layman's terms, what type of application machine learning had for you and how it could generally apply to just a general sports bettor out there listening.
Well, yeah, definitely. It helps to let data drive decisions rather than letting your decisions just be made from random looks at limited data. In general, most sports bettors only use very small portions of data to make decisions, right? You see trend guys out there, guys who, might be using like a simple machine learning model, like a linear regression or a logistic regression, or you might have heard a Poisson distribution before being used in football. If you use these simple models, you're generally going to shave your bias a lot, because if you're just making picks off of last 10 games or some sort of statistic like WOBA or something like that, you're not going to get too far. So you really need to kind of approach modeling in sports these days, especially with some sort of algorithm or some sort of large data process. So to answer your question, using data science can be as simple as using a simple program in Python like sklearn to just explore your data. So if you have kind of an idea of what might be important in a sport, like in baseball, it might be home runs or something like that. You really want to run your data or the data you collect through an algorithm and just kind of see if you're biased or not. I would suggest most bettors take that path. You learn a lot, I'll tell you that.
Can machine learning and data science capture a large portion of the market a large portion of the data that you need to make good decisions in the market? Or is it still a relatively early stages and you've really got to focus in on areas of importance to you and go from there?
Yeah. Okay. So if I got the question right,
let me put it this way: someone who picks a random trend and says, when the Seahawks play in London off a Thursday night game in the NFL, they're 1-7. They're picking obviously a very small sample of data that might be relevant for that match, whereas others will pick player information, others might pick just team information. Who knows? In terms of machine learning and the algorithmic approach, are you able to essentially bring in all the relevant areas of information that you want and try and make a better decision with all that, or are you just focusing on specifics?
Oh, okay, I got you. Yeah, generally no, right? Because most sports bettors never see the full data state. Like I call that the game state, all the data. To see all the data and to make good decisions with data science, you need a lot of data, right? You need many thousands of rows, preferably millions of rows of data just to get a good statistical understanding of the actions on the field and how they affect whatever you're looking at, whether it be a total or money line or something like that. So in general, most bettors will never have the ability to use machine learning at scale unless you have resources behind you. So at FansUnite, I'm pretty lucky because we have a good business and good relationships, we can see large scale data and then apply machine learning to that to get good results. Generally, as a sports book, you want asymmetric data, a lot of data that kind of the bettors don't have. So I'd say, it's not very helpful for the average guy to use machine learning unless they can get large scale data. Maybe like an MLB, you can do that with the pitch FX data because it's open source. But in general, you're not going to really model as a sports bettor in any other sport because you just don't have the data to match big guy like Pinnacle.
So what was your intention when you sort of sat down and built your data science ML approach to sports betting? Are you looking to create ratings? Are you looking to identify certain teams that might outperform the market in the past? And what are some of the things you're exactly looking for?
Right. So, that's a great question. So kind of what I'm looking to do is I'm looking for bias in the data. I mean, that's the game pretty much. So when I look at, say, all of Pinnacle's closing lines, I might look at kind of a distribution of kind of where the market ended up. And when I use data science, I'm trying to look at the data and trying to find out if basically all the bettors who go into making that closing line or as the line forms and converges to the closing line, I'm kind of just trying to discover if those bettors are making biased decisions. In machine learning, we call that overfitting, where basically people are modeling noise. And in a lot of marketplaces, even in the big five sports, which are pretty well understood, you can still find a lot of bias in the data and quite good edges. So to answer your question, I'm looking to build a win probability model and then measure if that win probability can be mistaken for noise. And if it is above a certain rate where I'm pretty sure my prediction isn't going to be generated from noise very often, I'll bet that game quite a lot with my bankroll.
So you're one sports bettor, let's say, or even a syndicate of sports bettors versus bookmakers with potentially hundreds of employees. How do you think bookmakers are approaching the same issue? Are they using detailed modeling approaches, do you think, or are they largely relying on market information and smart sports bettors to shift their lines?
Yeah, I'd probably say they're just copying Pinnacle's line. I mean, let's be honest. How the line is set is Pinnacle Sports right now. It's the gold standard because they just have the data. And data drives lines in our industry. And as a sports book, basically you just want as many customers to bet as possible so you get an idea of kind of where they're going to end up. And as you get more bets in, you can increase the lines, you can increase the handle that you would take from each bettor as the lines get more mature. So as a individual bettor, I probably would want to bet pretty early, right? And get the lines before they're pretty sharp. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. It's just pretty hard to beat the bookmaker in general.
And what about the closing line? How does that factor into all of your analysis? A lot of people are very sort of positive that it's, all the market information in one, and it's largely gospel, and some others may not value it as highly depending on the sport. But what's your general approach to how to utilize the starting price of a team or whatever it might be?
Oh yeah, 100%. The closing line is pretty much the gold standard for where you should kind of start thinking about calculations. It's kind of interesting, even the most cutting edge machine learning algorithms pretty much converge to Pinnacle's closing line if you don't filter out for noise, basically. So data is very noisy. And if you are not filtering out, say, like a contrarian bet, say you make a win probability, you look at the closing line, you think you have an edge, you really have to check if your result is based on noisy data. Otherwise, you're going to lose a lot of money. So kind of the idea here with the closing line is that it represents basically all the opinions of all these bettors who are basically overfitting in their models, and what they're doing is they're just making bets off of randomness. But when you put all the randomness together, it turns out to be a really great line. So to answer your question, Pinnacle makes a great line. It's a closing line. It's the gold standard. It's what you should base your calculation off of. And what you're really looking for is those situations where there might be just a little bit of bias in the line, like a heavy favorite or underdog, which is not being weighted properly.
If the closing line's so damn good, how do we get people to be professional sports bettors if it's so hard to win, if it's more than likely a lot of these models are closing in on that number where it ultimately lands at the end? It seems like a tough nut to crack.
It is extremely tough nut to crack. In fact, most sports bettors probably shouldn't try because they just don't have the data to drive calculations that are sophisticated enough to compete with the bookmaker. At FansUnite, I'm pretty blessed with, because we have a social sports betting site with many, many people who just track their systems, tens of thousands of people. So I get to see kind of the general patterns of how people think about betting and general strategies. And, it's really, really hard to beat the sports book. So the best way you can basically increase your chances is to never bet at a high margin sports book. That would be my first bit of advice to any bettor. You generally want to bet at Pinnacle or better, and that's kind of what's behind FansUnite's drive to use the blockchain, for instance. We really want to try to do better using machine learning to get a lower margin for bettors, and that's kind of what we're about.
I'm curious about all those, I'm sure you have a lot of information from all those people putting their picks or models or whatever it might be on your platform. Any other cool trends or patterns or other information you've seen from that that you're able to share, I suppose?
Yeah, I guess what's interesting is that even if you take a collection of the very best bettors on FansUnite, I mean, there's a couple guys who are just really, really good. And there's always going to be that. Of course, maybe 1 in 500 guys win consistently over 5,000 games, which is pretty much the gold standard for us. If you bet 5,000 games and you win money, you're probably plus EV. So kind of the interesting thing is that if you take like the top 100 gamblers and then you just kind of take their bets, they pretty much converge to breaking even with Pinnacle's closing line. So it's just really, really, really hard to win any money at a 2.4% margin or worse. And that's kind of what we found with our data, is that we can really look at, what is the bottom line for the bettor. And it's pretty much, you got to bet at Pinnacle or better, like maybe Matchbook or something, you can get a good line. That's pretty much what we learned from the data.
Do you think that 2.4% number has always been roughly the same, or do you think it's got closer and closer to zero? Was it 5%, 10 years ago, or or 6 or 7% 30 years ago, let's say, or in your opinion, or with some of the information you've got, have you seen that close in on closer to 0%?
Well, yeah. This all started with Betfair, right? When they so long ago, year 2000, they came out, and their lines were way down there, like 2% in some markets. And I thought it was going to go down to zero, but I've seen the anti-trend happen actually, where most books are just getting by with 5, 6, 7% margins. I mean, you look at DraftKings' latest offering; it's pretty high margin, and these guys, they know it's pretty hard to operate even at a 2.4% margin. The sharps will take you. So actually, I really believe it's going the other way, where these low margin books can't exist. Like you might see a guy like smarkets.com who are quite famously say, we're going to build the high volume, low margin model or bust. But if you don't have the data, you can't do that. And Pinnacle has massive data, right? So nobody can really offer a low margin unless they kind of turn to a machine learning approach, because it's just too hard to get the information to build a good closing line. And probably smart bettors are going to beat you up if you offer a low margin like that without the data to support it. So in my opinion, it's just getting worse. There's more charges everywhere. Everyone's charging, like Betfair charges premium charge and all that. It's really hard to make money if you don't get a really good margin. And again, that's what's kind of behind FansUnite's push to see how low we can drive the margin as possible.
So when you see they need the data coming in, are you talking about looking at smart punters and their bets and what they're betting on so they can adjust their lines and odds?
Yes, exactly. As well as not smart bettors, they're important too, because what you're trying to do is build a distribution of weighted opinion. And of course, the smart guys will be weighted more. I mean, you would weight Bob Bulgaris more than Joe Gambler. But Joe Gambler is still important because you need a good idea of the distribution of prices people are willing to take around an average price. Once you get a good idea, a lot of data-driven processes generally outperform simple heuristics or just a really smart guy behind a computer setting lines. You want a combination of smart guys and not so smart guys. Generally you put it all together and you get a really good idea of basically where you're anticipating handle to come on a market.
So what do you think is the optimal business model? And I probably know what you think the answer is, but in terms of on the operator side, if we're saying how difficult it is to recreate Pinnacle's model and get those very low margins in the market, and then also it's probably the optimal approach as well. Is there a middle ground in all of that? Do you think there's a place for the operators you mentioned before, the exchanges, to live somewhere in between without such high volume?
Yes. So I will admit I'm slightly biased here. I think that the answer is the blockchain. And what I mean by that is the only way that you can get more efficient is to get more data, right? That's essentially what the high volume, low margin model is. The more data in, the better and better you understand the distribution of people betting at your website, the more and more you can raise the maximum bet. And I think that's the idea. So on the blockchain, if people write data to the blockchain, you get a lot of bets, which is all public now because everything written to the blockchain is public. You can essentially get a much lower margin book with more data written to it. So essentially we imagine people operating on the blockchain, you would pull all their betting data. And then just because you have just more than Pinnacle, which is just a silo, you would naturally get lower margins quicker. So that's a possible path forward to collectively use data together instead of hoarding it into these individual silos and then selling it amongst each other or something like that. Another way to move forward, again, is just to use machine learning to be a little bit better at understanding large sports data, because I think sports data is proliferating. You see guys like Sportradar doing amazing work, and BetRadar, and all these guys who have this on-court data, 25 data points a second, exact position of players. When you have large and big data like that, that can be put into a machine learning algorithm and translated into more ROI for your trading team. Again, you can pass some of that value to the bettor in terms of lower margins. And that's kind of what FansUnite's committed to do.
So do you think it's as simple as sportsbooks should do pretty much nothing and copy Pinnacle, or watch Pinnacle very, very closely and copy the market, or go all in and gather as much data as they can, capture everything in the market, some of the stuff you've mentioned, and be really, cutting edge in terms of all the information they can get, use machine learning, and be a very, very sophisticated book? Or is there a place in the middle where it's worthwhile to be doing at an average level, let's say?
Yeah, well, they already do. So most books have a subscription to a wonderful company in London called TX Odds. And what they do is they gather together all of the APIs of the various sports betting companies, and then you can kind of build a synthetic odd from that or something for your sports book, like a weighted average of all the other guys. So generally, you can buy shared data and shared market pricing data and start your line from there. That's what I would suggest for any small sports book. So, you can take a number like 60% Pinnacle, 30% Bet365, and like a smattering of other guys. And then you would have a kind of a starting odd that you feel comfortable with. That's generally the process of a bookmaker, I think. And then what you'll do is you'll kind of adjust that for your individual gamblers. If you had for instance, a New Jersey-based sports book, and you have bettors from New Jersey, you can be pretty sure that the bias will be on like the Devils or something in a hockey game.
Yep.
So you might not just take Pinnacle's raw price or like a combination of different sports books prices. You might take them as a base price line and then adjust based upon the anticipated handle that you might collect from your bettors, say on a Devils game or something. I think it'd be a little bit higher if you're in New Jersey. So that's kind of like how you would do it, in my opinion.
Let's talk price. Unlike bookies and totes, the Betfair exchange is a low-margin, buy-sell, fixed odds marketplace where the value stays with the punter, not the house. Ready for the game within the game? Join betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So let's switch over to FansUnite. Take us through the inception, the idea creation, and the mission statement that got it all started.
Okay, so I'm the fifth employee of FansUnite. I came along about 2/3 of the way into that startup. So kind of what happened was my bosses, Duncan McIntyre and Darius Agdami, they made a website called FansUnite.com. And what they did was they basically built a tracker, kind of like tipster.com, another great website, guys like that. And you can track your bet on FansUnite.com or your betting system or ensemble of betting systems that you might have. You can track it all there. And what they did was they gave a virtual currency away where you can only bet up to like 250 units or something like that, and up to 5 units per bet. And kind of what that did was it allowed gamblers and bettors to track their systems and get a good idea of what's working, what's not. And it's all done on Pinnacle's closing line. So you have kind of a gold standard to measure things. Kind of what happened there was we were just giving this kind of virtual currency when I came on. We were starting to look at that site and the blockchain as a solution. And when you're giving a virtual currency to people, what they were doing was they were trying to get high ROIs to get like a subjective viewpoint of how their touting service might work. And we realized that, hey, this could be like a blockchain application, because what these people are doing is they're just providing their information to FansUnite in return for like social acceptance. But we can do a little bit better. We could probably build a protocol for these people to share their data and maybe get paid for it. So that's kind of like the history of FansUnite. I came on in about year 3, and they had been going for 3 years on a social website. And then we decided, let's go build a protocol so all sports books can use the blockchain and utilize it for their own advantage.
So you mentioned about the ability to basically bet with certain unit sizes and have a token essentially. Yeah. Did you find people's behavior changing when they're not necessarily using real money versus a token, where they can essentially try and make it look like they're winning or over leverage or over betting, those type of things?
Yes, their behavior didn't change when they got a virtual token, but it sure changed when there was and I wasn't there when this happened, but what their kind of, intuition was to limit the tokens. Like you can only have so many tokens, and you can bet 1 to 5 tokens, and you only get 250 tokens to bet with a month. So it was kind of this monthly limit, and that really changed behaviors, because when you're trying to compete to get a high ROI on the system and be in the top 10 or the top 20, your limitation changes your behavior, because you're not going to wild 5-unit max bet a bunch of Sacramento Kings bets.
Yep.
Like, you're just going to lose your money, right? It's not going to work out for you. So, we noticed that people would start to be more careful and kind of make these little heuristics for managing their tokens so that they can kind of boost out a max ROI. A combination of favorites and underdogs. And it was really interesting to see that data myself as a data scientist, because I learned a lot about kind of the psychology behind it and how bettors react when they're winning and losing.
So why do you opt for a decentralized protocol versus obviously many other options you could have gone down in terms of paths with this type of business?
Yeah, that was a no-brainer for us. We were looking at the state of the sports betting industry. I've been betting a long time. I bet a lot of Bitcoin. I bought at 300. I did a ton of bets on Nitrogen Sports, and I love those guys, but I was not happy with the margins that I was getting and the cash in, cash out process. So we started to look at the blockchain, and it became pretty evident to us that it offered a lot of very beneficial things to the bettors. And most bettors have Bitcoin or ETH or something like that, and they've done a few bets. But when you build a protocol that's decentralized, what you're trying to do is reward people for providing data that resolves bets. So kind of how it works with the protocol is people can go and they can, like, say, get a fan token and bet on the FansUnite website. But people who hold tokens can also resolve the bets by basically providing the data for the results. So, like fixing, like when you have your fixture and you need a result data, you might go to like a company out there, like Psy Gaming or something, who have scouts in the stands. Kind of what we thought, or what we envisioned, was to reward people who take part in blockchain network by allowing them to provide data from the stands rather than scouts, or from their TVs, or from whatever data feed that they have. So a lot about decentralizing a sportsbook revolves around data and how you compensate people for providing it, because that's all really a blockchain sportsbook is. You make something called a smart contract. It's a program that holds your bet in escrow, and it just awaits data to release that bet in a trustless manner. So to answer your question, after all of that, what does the blockchain and these smart contracts give to the bettor? Basically, it allows you to get your money in and out super quick, because you don't have to send a $12,000 wire to Pinnacle and wait 7 days for it to get there. It's horrible. So, with the blockchain, bettors just have a ton of opportunity to just buy a crypto quickly and get it in, get it out. And because we're envisioning a protocol where we have many sports books sharing their data, which is totally public on the blockchain, we think we can really get those margins down past 2.4%. Like I said before, the more data that you have, the better and better you are at identifying what the closing line ought to be. So, when we looked at those aspects, like the ability to maybe reduce the margin on the blockchain with more data and to give bettors more control over their money, we also saw that people were banning a lot of winners. Like, I've been banned a few times. I'm sure a lot of bettors have been, just for winning, a couple $1,000s one day, maybe on a lucky bet. And on the blockchain, you can't really ban people. It's a smart contract, which is just a programmatic, it's just a program which manages the bet in a trustless, fraud-resistant manner. And when you have that, you can't you can't ban winners when they win. People can just make bets and trust that the bet they make is paid out, and that they don't suffer the consequences and have to take their money out and all that stuff. So essentially, I guess we're kind of sick and tired that bettors never really get compensated for providing their data to the network. So this decentralized protocol really rewards bettors for providing their data. Every time you make a bet, it increases the demand for the token, which resolves the bet. And again, that probably can be passed down to the bettors in the form of a lower margin, the value produced from that, rather than maybe some intermediary company, which takes a huge cut.
So is there a minimum or even a sweet spot of users and liquidity that goes through the entire platform to make it viable?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. We don't know where the point of inception will be, but we're working pretty hard to bring a few partners onto our protocol. We'll launch our own sportsbook as a initial offering, and we hope that 4 or 5 sportsbooks providing a few thousand customers of data each, a few thousand customers worth of data each should kind of add up to a fairly large amount of data that explains the behavior of the bettors and should be able to drive that line down. So we're thinking maybe, 15,000, 20,000 actives betting every day should really get the ball rolling.
It sounds like it might be a monstrous technical challenge to do all of this and have a nice user interface for those that may not understand what's going on behind the curtain to make all this possible. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yeah. Blockchain is a new technology, and it's very hard to make that scale because it's a distributed database. That means it's just a little bit slower than kind of a database you might use in a normal sportsbook. So there's a lot of technical challenges around making these smart contracts, making them fraud resistant, because the last thing you want to do is, publish this cool smart contract sportsbook and then suddenly fraud, and then people lose their money. So you have to be really careful and make sure there's zero fraud in it, that the data is immutable, that it's never changes or can't be changed. And, there's a lot of problems around the blockchain, but we have a really, really great team of really experienced people. And I think the strength of our team addresses a lot of those issues. From the side of data analysis, that's pretty tricky too. It's a lot of work to make really great odds. So we have a few PhDs in our company, we're all working together to basically try to handle the glut of the sports. Because when you make a sports book, there's a lot of sports people want to bet on. And sometimes some of those sports have only a little bit of data. So it's hard to get a really good model really quickly. So those are kind of some of the challenges we face, but we think we're up to it.
How do you think you'll fit in with the broader industry sort of moving forward? Do you think it'll remain a niche? Do you think you can carve out a much larger portion? Obviously, a lot of people are probably used to their current sportsbook, whether it's an app or a website, or even betting in person in the US. But do you expect this to be a much larger portion of the market?
Well, we absolutely are focused on the protocol. Our sportsbook, where we try to drive the margin down to 1%, with all the techniques that we've been discussing, is just kind of a centerpiece. And a place for bettors to go bet. But we're really focused on the protocol part, where we're trying to be the smart contract engine for all sportsbooks. So we really, really look to build a collaborative, risk-free solution that is easy to integrate for all sportsbooks. And we've talking to a couple of them, and we're trying to get that technology to a place where it's understandable by a large segment of population who might not be so technical or not into crypto in our industry. So I guess to answer your question, our focus is definitely on the collaboration and integration with existing entities who have enough scale to move the margin. We really want people to adopt crypto because it really helps bettors, especially with getting money in quickly. I just don't want to wait 7 days to make a bet, that sort of stuff. And partnering with some KYC partners, we hope to make the process very seamless and really, really focus on maximum choice for the sports bettors. Of course, if you can get on the blockchain, you can take your money in and out so fast that if you have 10 or 12 entities operating on the FansUnite protocol, then bettors have the choice between 12 sports books within 30 seconds. And that's just great for business and great for bettors.
Yeah, that's very cool. So I want to ask you, it's the time of recording, it's NBA season starting up. Everyone's excited about NBA.
Oh, yeah.
You're an expert, so it would be remiss of me not to ask a couple of questions about NBA betting.
Sure, let's go.
Let's start with some sort of advanced analytics that you would value or rely on when looking at, from a betting perspective, what's going to help you in terms of things that are predictive.
Yeah, you should be good at projecting minutes, that's for one. So generally, you want to look at the starters and their aggregates. So, you might look the last 10, 20, 30 games, depending on what algorithm you use, it changes what matters. But you want to look at the past 20 or 30 games, just add up their basic statistics and really, really get your minutes down. Because in basketball, there's a lot of flow and there's, a lot of statistics like points per possession, points per minute that you might want to look at. Generally most people, so I'll talk in terms of a normal bettor who doesn't have great access to statistics like FansUnite does. So a normal guy can really, really shave down their losing percentage, I guess, by just really looking at the aggregates over the last maybe 20, 30 games, and then really get your minutes down and peg those aggregates to that amount of minutes that you expect a player to play. Most times, you might get burnt on like an Anthony Davis game in NBA. I really hate betting on the Pelicans for that reason. Because every time I bet him, he's out in the first 10 minutes, and I screw the minutes up, and my calculation is bad. So, really, really think about, how much you expect a player to play. Because when you get that number down, all the other numbers can flow from there. Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned flow a couple of times. It seems like something that can never be quantified. Is that true, or do you think we're getting to a point these days where we can start doing that? And obviously a lot of people listening potentially will be betting live in a lot of these games. I've heard in the past from a few smart people on the NBA side that they would look for, when Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook were playing together, certain, let's call them flow impacts that had a relevance in terms of live betting, and when they would both sit out and things like that. Do you have any ability moving forward, do you think, to start quantifying some of these things that have in the past certainly been only possible with a trained eye?
Yeah, that's a funny story, because I did before the NBA cut off all access to the data. So you remember in 2016, January, they cut off the official court tracking API, where you had all the beautiful XY data, everything you needed to really model the flow of the game. So basketball is kind of a game of relationships between the players and the players they're playing against, how you switch off, what types of plays you make. So in 2016, I had a pretty sophisticated model. I was making about 6.57% ROI, which was just crazy high for me. And then what they did was they cut that off because they did a deal with Second Spectrum and Sportradar, who now have all of that court tracking data. So I can tell you for sure that modeling the flow of the game and the interactions in the game is totally possible, because they already do it. Second Spectrum is the company. They're out of LA. Great company. I totally suggest viewers look at their website and check them out. But the problem is the data is very expensive. It's like you're paying, six figures a month just to access that stuff now, and the court tracking stuff. So average bettors can't really look at that. So for the average guy, no, you can't really get the flow of the game down very well. But if you have a lot of money, like a syndicate, you can absolutely do that to great effect.
Any general advice for those looking to bet NBA or have recently adopted NBA as one of their major sports to try and make money out of?
Yep. How I would look at that, I'm a contrarian guy. Sometimes I like to bet a spot where there's a favorite, but what I mostly like to do is bet dogs. And I really, really analyze my method of choosing a dog, basically, because that's where you kind of make the highest ROI, I think, personally. So basically, identify good dogs you think have a good chance to win in basketball, and then really, really dig into the data and try to see the correlations between the data you're using and if you're just modeling noise or not. So, a lot of bettors will get stuck betting like the Sacramento Kings at 6.2 every single time they lose at the end of the game, because maybe, the data looks good, but you really, really have to check that it's not biased and you're not modeling noise. It's a big thing. So there's some ways to do that, and I can give you a follow-up link to one of our articles that kind of explains that. But that's kind of how I would approach NBA. I hate betting favorites because in the NBA, the home court advantage has been just dying over the last few years. So you might have a 55.5% chance of winning at home now, as opposed to when it was 60. And that's because of the three-pointer and the kind of the advent of the three-pointer age, where everyone, even centers, are taking threes now. So it's really, really hard to win favorites, I think, in the NBA because of this new strategy where everyone just jacks threes for 3/4. So I look at underdogs, and I'm really, really careful and picky about it, but that's what I do in the NBA if I was just a normal guy.
Interesting. So I had a recent guest on who said one thing that would be valuable for him is just to solve a problem that he has or anyone else has. So I want to ask you, what are some of the problems you have in sports betting, in data analysis, and whatever it might be within the whole realm of what we've discussed that people out there can look into and try and solve, or maybe they're already trying to solve them, that would be useful and relevant?
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. Look, if you're generating data from any source that's in-play data, it's super valuable right now. So one problem that I am really, really passionate about solving and would be really, really interested in talking to people about is capturing of data from game tape. So, they have algorithms now, it's called image processing, where you can look at like game tape and kind of detect the court lines and the players on the court. And if you can do that kind of stuff, or have the ability to code that kind of stuff and get really neat data, it's worth a lot, especially to your own betting model if you could actually get that. So generally, I would suggest looking to find asymmetric data that nobody else has. That's when you win a lot of money in sports betting. So basically taking NBA tape and just kind of tracking when players do pick and rolls, even with your eye, pick and rolls or high screen threes or something like that. Corner threes, these are the things you want to look at. And I think I was reading Bob Voulgaris on Twitter, and he was talking about things like that. I measured everything: corner threes, pick and rolls. This type of asymmetric data gives you just a vast advantage over a normal bettor. So if you can find data that like nobody else has, or put it together like nobody else has, it's worth a lot, especially to your own model.
Awesome, Stephen. That's great. Before I let you go, I just want to let the listeners know how they could get in touch with you or reach out, and I can certainly point them to a couple of articles you've written that I read in the last couple of weeks that are relevant to some of the things we've talked about. So I'll add those links in the show notes. But in terms of, is Twitter the best way? What's the best and easiest way to do it?
Yeah, you can get to me at Twitter at SaberCruncher, SaberCruncher. I'm there. I'm pretty much on every day. So if anyone wants to chat about data or anything, I'm there.
Awesome. Thanks very much for your time, and all the best and continued success with the FansUnite stuff.
Oh, thank you so much, Jake. Thanks for having me.